Hello everyone, this is part 2 of our lecture Geoelectrics, Geophysical Sounding with Electricity. From the previous video, you should remember this figure here. So in this figure, you see a hemispheric subsurface. So the surface is here in gray, and we have two layers in the subsurface. And at the surface, current is injected at point A and B. And so you see the current lines are the arrows here. And the potential field is making the arcs here. It is measured by the electrodes M and N. So that is used to measure delta V. So the electrical potential are the circles here. So some of the important formulas we have derived in the previous lecture is the expression of the resistivity. So you see the expression of resistivity is U divided by I times Kf. And Kf is a factor of unit meter that depends on basically the electrodes. So here there are two electrodes that are used to measure the voltage. So you have four distances that are involved. The distance between A and M, A and N, and the distance between B and M and B and N. So that's a unit meter factor. So the aim is to measure and to visualize the apparent resistivity rho A as a function of the distance L between the current nodes. So we can try to do a profile of apparent resistivity. So that's a surface view of the apparatus. You have the current electrode here and the potential electrodes here in blue, and you have the distance A separates these two electrodes. The distance L separates these two electrodes. So L divided by 2 is from the middle of the experiment to the current electrode. So to do this kind of measurement, we will play with the distances between potential electrodes and current electrodes. So this point is going to move. This point is going to move. What we call an apparent resistivity is the resistivity for an equivalent homogeneous background. So you will see that in practice, the subsurface is heterogeneous, and we will first measure it as a homogeneous background, and then we will try to recover the actual distribution of resistivity by running an inversion procedure, to be discussed in the next slide. So there are different types of arrangements that can be used. We'll briefly discuss dipole-dipole method. We mostly discuss Schlumberger method as well as multi-electrode method. So again, a view of the whole experiment, or this surface view here. One thing to keep in mind is that the further the electrode that measures the potential is away from the current electrode, the deeper is the sounding. So if you measure the potential very close to the electrode, then you receive a very shallow signal. But if you measure the potential very much away from the current electrode, then you start feeling electrical field that is associated with transfer of current at depths. So that's a very important relationship. The closer to the source, the shallower, and the further away from the source is the deeper. So let's consider now half of the experiment because it is symmetric. So that's the middle of the experiment, the current electrode, the potential electrode. The distance L divided by 2 is here. So to make a 1D sounding, one can try to construct what's called an apparent conductivity curve. So for this, the potential electrodes are kept at a fixed location, but the injection electrode, or the current electrode, is being moved. So the distance L over 2 is increasing. Using the formula we derived before, we can compute rho A for a given value of the distance. And this is U divided by I times Kf, and this Kf depends on the distance of the electrode. So of course, if you change the distance of the electrode, so this distance, L divided by 2, you can compute a variation of this apparent resistivity. So apparent resistivity will vary with a change of the distance between the blue and the red point. This can be further converted to a depth model. So here you have the depth, and here you have the conductivity, and by doing post-processing of this data, one can obtain a 1D model of the subsurface. So these are two types of arrangement or methods. The one we discussed just before was the Schlumberger method. So it's basically using 4 electrodes, but locating the 2 potential electrodes in between the 2 current electrodes. The other method, which is mentioned now, is the dipole-dipole method. It's basically using again 4 electrodes, but it's locating the potential electrodes in a completely different manner than the current electrodes. So these two methods differ by the relative position of potential and current electrodes. So now we want to discuss the multi-electrode method. So now we consider a surface here, and at the top of the surface we will put a lot of electrodes. The red ones will inject the current, and the blue ones will measure the electrical field. The black ones are inactive in this example. So if we do this type of measurement, now we can access and do one measurement of apparent resistivity associated to this distribution of electrodes. So that's one measurement. Now, if we activate another couple of electrodes for the measurements, we will probe a bit deeper. Remember, the further away you are from the injection point, the deeper you will measure your apparent resistivity. And now, if we do it for all the electrodes, we use all of them to measure, then we will get apparent resistivity measurements for a given pseudo depth. We don't know the actual depth. And so this type of measurement can be achieved for a 2D section in pseudo depth coordinate. So we have apparent resistivity in pseudo depth. In case you have a structure, you will be able to resolve it in 2 dimensions with this type of apparatus. The only thing is, since these measurements are measurement of apparent resistivity, we always assume that we assume that there is a local value of resistivity, but it is relative to an homogeneous background. We do not know exactly which depth is represented. So that is what is called the pseudo depth. And this is a pseudo section of resistivity. What is needed is to run an inversion procedure. So that's basically a model to transfer our measurements in pseudo depth into a model in actual depth. So that's what we will call an inversion procedure. And you may wonder why there was, in addition to electrodes, there was a computer on the field picture. Initially, it's because this computer now is doing the model, is transferring the pseudo depth section to an actual depth distribution of resistivity. So this model is a result of an inversion, and this requires computation. So let's have a look at an actual application from Buraburg. It's actually taken from the slides of Andreas Junge. That's an example of application of geoelectrics to archaeology. This is a pseudo-depth section. So these are all measurements of apparent resistivity with depth. This is the result of the measurement. So once we have this data in pseudo depth, we need to run an inversion procedure. So the inversion is what we will find the resistivity distribution in true depth coordinate that best fits the measured data. It's based on a physical model of electrical current propagation. But this is basically a modeling activity. It's going to find iteratively what is the best distribution of resistivity that explains what has been measured on the field. That's a computation. This is the result of the computation. So the model here, which is obtained, so you see a map of resistivity in true depth, and you see here a circular anomaly. So it's very interesting because in this map here, in pseudo depth, you see basically a trend, like two lines here. And on in true depth correction, you see a circular region. So you may wonder what's the link between these two patterns? Is this making sense at all? Or is this model completely wrong? So let's have a look again at this example. So we go step by step now. We have multiple electrodes at the surface, and here, close to the surface, there is an anomaly. So we inject current from this point, and we measure the potential. We're using the other electrodes here. And when you use these two sets of electrodes to inject the current, then you will measure one apparent resistivity here. Now we use a second set. We keep the same distance between the electrodes here, so we can basically always sense the same depth. We just shift the electrical current electrodes towards the right, and then we measure this apparent resistivity which has a given value. Keep on doing this thing, and once we shift one of the electrical current electrode above the anomaly, then the measurement here will be biased by this anomaly. So what is being measured here is being affected by this thing. It's biased because of this trajectory of electrical current. If we shift again the apparatus, now it's going here, and the measurement, there is no anomaly right below the electrical current electrodes, and the measurement is now recording the background value. Again, we shift, we record the background value, and once the second electrode falls back onto the anomaly, there is a bias, or there is a variation introduced in the data. Now the electrical current is affected by this. So we shift again until the end, and here you have background resistivity, apparent resistivity values. So basically that's the pattern. You see two anomalies in the measurements, but there is actually only one true anomaly. So one can go in depth. So if you increase the spacing between the two electrodes, you will measure a little bit deeper, and you will have the same effect. As soon as one electrode is basically above the anomaly, the apparent resistivity will be affected. And this goes on and on. So the final picture is basically two apparent resistivity layers which are dipping in opposite direction. That's exactly what was observed or what was measured on the field on the archaeological site of Buraburg. This is this pattern here. So this trend should reflect only one anomaly. So the measurements are consistent with a model of a single circular anomaly. And sometimes one can actually check the ground truth, especially in archaeology, because at some point people want to dig a hole and verify and find interesting things. So the hole was dug there, and there was indeed a cylindrical anomaly from an ancient construction. So there was actually really one anomaly and not two. So sometimes it's possible to verify the model by making a simple observation. So that's the conclusion of the geoelectrics lecture. So it's a powerful tool to sound the subsurface. It can retrieve the spatial distribution of resistivity and conductivity. The basic equipment which is needed is a battery, which will be used to inject current. And you will need electrodes to inject the current on one side and measure potential differences on the other side. One additional thing is also that you need a computer. This is what will be used to perform the inversion. So remember, the inversion is what is transferring your result, your measurements of apparent resistivity to true depths. And sometimes a shovel can be useful to check the ground truth. Thanks for your attention.